Christopher Columbus was the man who discovered the New World, changing the course of history. His voyages would bring Europe to the Americas, bringing wealth and power to these nations, and result in the spread of diseases that would wipe out a majority of Native Americans. But before we can talk about his voyages, we must talk about his youth. Columbus was born in 1451, and while we don't know what day he was born on, we know it had to fall between the months of August and October. Despite his voyages being in the name of a nation we call today Spain, he was born in northwestern Italy in the small but wealthy town of Genoa. Columbus's father owned a wool weavery, and originally Columbus was going to learn the same trade as his father, which was what most people had done during his time, but his calling was somewhere else. During his youth, he would be at the docks talking to wealthy traders coming in and eventually got an apprenticeship as an agent. He would travel on Genoa ships and may have even visited London at one point. After a few years, he moved to Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, where he would continue as a merchant. There he would marry Philippa, a wealthy noblewoman, but after just a few years, when he was returning from a trading expedition in West Africa, she died unexpectedly. During this time, he had noticed a problem that most had. For thousands of years, goods from China, like spices, had to travel thousands of miles across Asia through several kingdoms and empires, which inevitably led to goods having trouble going to Europe. After the Crusades, which is a very long story, not much in the end changed land-wise, but did allow Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa to have deals with nations in the Middle East, resulting in few states having a near monopoly. So even the goods that made it to Europe had to go through these two nations, which greatly marked up the price, causing spices to be worth more than gold. So Columbus brought up an idea. What if instead of getting goods from China east, Europe goes west, bypassing the land barrier? Before I continue, I would like to say that there's this misconception that people believed that the earth was flat during this time. It was common knowledge that the earth was round, thanks to people like Ptolemy, and this idea may have been around all the way back to 500 BC. What Columbus thought that was controversial at the time was how large the earth was. After miscalculating the earth's length, using what I'm probably going to pronounce wrong, Alfganus measurements, he believed Earth to be much more smaller than it actually was. He brought the idea to the King of Portugal, but he was dismissive of the idea due to the iffy measurements and the Portuguese preferring to find a way around Africa instead of going on a suicide mission west. So instead, Columbus went to the nation Castile, or what we call Spain today, and brought the idea to the king there. Columbus quickly made friends with the influential Queen Isabella due to him being a devout Catholic, and convinced them to fund his voyage with 3 ships promising gold, spices, and devout servants. Columbus was given 3 ships named the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and started to travel. The ships traveled for several months with no land in sight. Many of the sailors were starting to lose hope and were wanting to turn back, but eventually the crew spotted land. Their ships landed on the New World on October 12th, 1492. When they landed, they were met with the Taino people, who met them with gifts. Columbus had brought Luis de Torres as a translator since he knew several languages like Arabic and Hebrew, but he was not able to understand them. Columbus had to communicate with basic sign language at first and believed he must have landed on the islands of what he heard called Japan. After seeing the natives were wearing small gold trinkets, he questioned them on where they found it. They told him that of the land south, which they claimed to have gold. Before Columbus left, he kidnapped a group of Native Americans that were near his ship that he hoped to use as translators, but sadly most of them would perish from illnesses just a few years later. He continued to explore the islands and made a small fort in Hispania and eventually left back to Spain. When he returned, he claimed to have found a new way to China, bringing back goods and slaves from the New World. Isabella made him a nobleman. He stretched the truth and claimed that there was a massive amount of gold in the lands he discovered. Castile funded a second voyage. Columbus quickly gathered 15,000 soldiers, colonists, and priests to make a colony in the New World. When Columbus made it back to the fort, he found it destroyed. When he left the soldiers there, they quickly disobeyed his orders and went around attacking the tribes around them for gold, and the tribes quickly reacted by destroying their fort. Columbus decided to make his colony near the area, named La Isabela, after the queen back home. The colonists quickly built homes and settled in the new colony. Columbus would encourage the colony to enslave the natives there, justifying it by claiming that he was converting them to become holy servants. Thousands of natives were raided and stripped of any valuables they had, and were forced to grow crops and gather small amounts of gold in the rivers. In the end, tens of thousands would die from illness and famine, shrinking the Taino population by almost 90%. Problems started to arise when the colony was formed, though. The majority of the settlers that volunteered to go to the New World were only interested in the stories of gold and wealth. They wanted to just get rich and go home. This attracted the wrong type of people to start a colony, so when they settled, a famine quickly came across the settlers, who were not experienced in growing the food in the New World, and in the end, 2/3 of the original colonists died from starvation and illness. Columbus wanted to go back to Castile to get more settlers and goods, but he needed to bring something back to Castile, so he gathered 1,500 slaves back to the Old World, but only 500 would survive the trip. Columbus was able to convince the king and queen to fund a third voyage due to rumors of there being a huge continent south of Hispania. So after several more months of sailing back to the New World, Columbus spotted the islands of Trinidad and then the islands on the northern coast of what today is the country of Venezuela. This marks the first time Europeans made contact on the mainland of the Americas. Columbus returned back to his colony in Hispania, but found the colonists were going against his rule. After Columbus took care of the problem by hanging the rebel leader, he sent ships back to the Old World, requesting to get a royal commissioner to help him run the colony, but that completely backfired on him. The royalty were now starting to hear the problems the colony was going through and sent Franco de Bobadilla to investigate how well it was running. When Bobadilla reached the colony, he found it in a terrible state. After just a few days, he witnessed 5 colonists hung for raiding and terrorizing the natives, which he got upset with. It was also not nearly as profitable as he liked, and the colonists were still suffering from illness and starvation. Bobadilla used that esprit justice to arrest Columbus and his brother Diego, so they can stand trial in Castile. When the royals heard of Columbus being arrested, they were tremendously upset he was in chains. They had to wait for Bobadilla to come back with how the colony was doing, not having the governor in chains. Despite this, they still heard arguments by both sides. Bobadilla claimed that Columbus had regularly used horrendous punishments like torture and mutilation. One example that he argued was when a woman insulted his brother, he had her tongue cut off and forced her to march around the streets. Also, how he would have natives that rebelled have their parts scattered around the colony, as an example. Please keep in mind, though, many historians are conflicted on how accurate Bobadilla's claims were due to him despising Columbus and wanting to be governor himself. This does not mean Columbus did not do anything bad. He still, if you remember, enslaved thousands and was a brutal governor who did use torture as punishment. In the end, the royals let Columbus go and gave him back his wealth and status, yet they did not give neither Bobadilla nor Columbus governorship of Hispania, but to Nicolas de Oviedo, another influential man, instead. After being freed, Columbus was able to fund a 4th voyage to the Americas, still believing to be very near to Asia and wanting to make contact with China. By traveling west, he was told to avoid Hispania due to his recent controversy though. When Columbus made it to the Caribbean, he noticed a hurricane was starting to form, so tried to dock at Hispania, disobeying orders so that he can avoid the weather. But when he tried to dock there, the governor dismissed the idea of a hurricane and refusing him entry. Not believing Columbus, he sent a treasure fleet back to the old world, but was destroyed by the hurricane, and ironically, Bobadilla happened to be on that fleet, killing him. Columbus's ships were able to survive the hurricane with minor damages and continued the journey. They traveled to the tip of Cuba, then eventually made it to Central America in what is today Honduras. There he met with a trading canoe of Native Americans. He noticed that they had much more complex weaponry than the Caribbean natives. They were part of the Mayan culture, and had Columbus gone north a few hundred miles, he would have seen several cities built by these cultures. In the end, Columbus decided to go south instead, and after seeing the natives in Panama wearing much more gold ornaments to the Caribbean tribes, made a fort and decided to travel back to Hispania, unable to find a path to China. Columbus was having a tough time, with his mission failing, but at least it couldn't get worse. But it did, with a storm striking his ships, and they sank. Somehow, Columbus and a few of his ships survived, but were now stranded on the northern beach of Jamaica. Columbus has sent a few of his sailors on canoes to Hispania to ask to be rescued, but the governor, Nicola, despised Columbus and turned a blind eye, while also actively making it difficult for Columbus to be rescued. After feuds started to get low, Columbus ironically had to rely on Native Americans to feed him and his men for several months. After being stranded for 4.5 months, he was finally able to be rescued by a ship passing by and made it back to Castile. This would be his final journey. From when he got home, he went into retirement. He did not retire poor though. During his travels, he was promised 10% of all wealth transferred from the New World. While he only received a small part of it, he was able to live his final years as a noble in moderate wealth. He didn't have many years though, for when he was stranded, his health had taken a toll, and in the end, he had died from what was believed gout at the age of 55. Columbus would never find a path to China, for his calculations were thousands of miles off, and if the roadblock called the New World was not there, he would have certainly starved. But his discoveries were arguably bigger than a new trade route to China. His voyages would reveal two large land masses that were full of life and resources that the Europeans would use. An age of colonization would follow, with many other European countries following suit. But all of this would come at a terrible price. The land was full of millions of Native Americans, all having different cultures and ways of life, but that changed when the Europeans came. Due to diseases, up to 90% of all Native Americans would perish, and others would be subjugated. Christopher Columbus would be a controversial figure in the history books. He was an explorer that found new lands and discoveries, not being deterred by the dangers, while at the same time, though, was ruthless against disobedience of his peers. Natives to him were barely considered humans who were meant to be enslaved, justifying it as converting people to the Christian faith. In the end, for the better or worse, he did change the course of history. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Unless you don't, then you can leave and have a wonderful day.